So Marcus, thank you so much for this very kind and generous introduction. This lecture series has become so prestigious in this field of business ethics that I'm very honored to be part of it. So the pleasure is mine. I also want to thank your team that make it so easy and pleasurable to be here. And I want to thank you, the audience, on the way from the airport to the school here. The cab driver mentioned tomorrow is the national holiday here in Austria. I didn't know. And so thanks for delaying your long weekend for this event. So the topic of my talk tonight is unintended consequences, business and human rights challenges in the apparel and technology sector. And I want to start off, I'm excited to give this talk today because it's a new theme for me. I haven't published on this topic yet. It relates to work that I've done before, but I couldn't give you a published reference on this very topic. So I look very much forward to the discussion after the talk and to your feedback. To give you an overview, I'll start off with my argument in a nutshell. Companies, I argue, are increasingly aware that they need to manage the effects their actions have on human rights. The world is increasingly interconnected, and transparency is a fact of life. So companies that operate globally have very long supply chains, and in those supply chains, whatever human rights risks and abuses occur can end up on the front page of the New York Times, for example. And that's unpleasant for any company to be in the spotlight in that context. To do so, many companies engage in so-called corporate social responsibility initiatives. And Marcus told me that this school is unique in that classes around corporate social responsibility are mandatory here. So everyone who gets a degree here will have been exposed to CSR. So I can assume that there's sort of some knowledge base around what it means for companies to engage in corporate social responsibility. It's quite impressive how these corporate social responsibility initiatives have evolved over the past 2 decades. Yet, their effectiveness remains questionable. Just this week, I had a call with UNICEF. They told me about their efforts, decade-long efforts, to reduce, ideally eliminate child labor in the cocoa sector of the Ivory Coast. And they tell me that corporations are very engaged. Mars, Nestle, they're all trying really hard to get rid of child labor in the cocoa industry in the Ivory Coast. Yet, the number of children that they estimate work in the sector is at a record high. So you wonder, what is the effectiveness of these CSR initiatives? So I argue, despite of companies' best intentions, current CSR approaches fail to look deeply at the business models that lead to systemic human rights harms. And throughout the next 45 minutes, I'll elaborate further on this argument. So one reason why I want to talk about this is because I'm a passionate teacher of business and human rights, and my students come to me with some prior knowledge on CSR, sustainability, and all these buzzwords in the field. And they come to my class and they're like, what is different about business and human rights? Why should I take yet another class in sort of the broader area of sustainability? And you may wonder as well, so towards the end of the talk, I'll get to what I consider the distinctive feature of business and human rights. Many of my colleagues even consider human rights as part of CSR, but I argue for the actual implementation, a radically different approach is required. So quick outline. I'll first say a few more words about the NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights. We're quite a unique institution, and about the role that corporations play for human rights implementation in the world today. Then I'll give 2 examples from 2 sectors, manufacturing, apparel industry, specifically in Bangladesh, and a second example from the technology sector. And in both examples, I will highlight that CSR initiatives didn't get us to a point where human rights risks are effectively mitigated. But to effectively address human rights would require a critical reflection of the business models that those companies in those sectors engage in. And so I've chosen 2 sectors. They're very different. They have very different human rights challenges. In manufacturing, most prominent human rights challenges are labor rights and global supply chains. And in a way, this is the classic case for business and human rights. You're probably too young to remember, but in the early 90s, it was the first case of Nike being exposed due to child labor in their South Asian footwear factories. And it was the first time a global brand was in the news for human rights violations in their supply chain. So it's a very established industry that has been challenged and has been struggling to establish fundamental rights in their core operations for almost 3 decades. The second example from the technology industry, it's a fairly new industry, and I focus on social media and internet service providers. So that's a very young industry, probably 10 years, where now when you open the newspaper, you can find all kinds of stories about how human rights are affected by this industry. Right to privacy, right to freedom of expression, and that calls for very, very difficult questions. How to resolve the tension between freedom of expression and, for example, hate speech or fake news. Very difficult. So then, as promised, in part 4, I'll come to the differentiation between CSR and business and human rights, and then I'll wrap up my talk coming back to the title, which after some reflection I don't find ideal anymore. Now I'd rather call this talk Intention Undermining Business Models instead of Unintended Consequences. So let's start. So this is the opening page of our center's website, which I invite you to visit. The mission of our center is to challenge and empower business leaders to make practical progress on human rights. I said that we're unique. Well, as we started our center in 2013, we were at the time the very first and also the only human rights center at a business school. In the US, there are many law schools that deal with human rights, but not a single business school had put human rights on the agenda. Today, 5 years later, I think we're still the only fully institutionalized center, but a number of schools have started picking up the broader theme, and they've started human rights initiatives, etc. The foundation of our work is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Here you can see this document, which I would argue is a document that enshrines the greatest global consensus of how we want to deal with each other in one document, in 30 articles. The document is held by Eleanor Roosevelt. She was commissioning the drafting of this document, and it was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. So if you're quick in math, you know that this 2018 is a special year. We're actually celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I argue that now, more than ever, this document is relevant. And I want to show you some contextual factors that lead me to that conclusion. First of all, the business and human rights challenges are really omnipresent. I mentioned the world is becoming more interconnected, more transparent. I can tell you that senior managers working for a fashion brand worry constantly about sweatshop conditions in their global supply chain. Senior managers at an extractives company, they worry about community conflict around their oil exploration sites, for example, in South America. They also worry about the behavior of private security companies that protect their assets at exploration sites, for example, in Africa. And in the technology sector, I would argue that senior managers worry about how can they manage the balance between freedom of expression on the one hand and the contamination of their platforms with fake news, hate speech, and politically motivated disinformation while providing their services. So these issues are real. I think they're amongst the least well understood business issues today. If you don't believe me that they're omnipresent, you can check out this site, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. It's a think tank that tracks over 8,000 companies' human rights challenges, and you can find daily updates. So they're basically just pool from the news what kind of human rights allegations companies face. I also want to show you a map of the world as it's drawn up by a think tank organization called Fund for Peace. They've been putting together what they for a long time called the Failed State Index. For a while now they reframed it and call it the Fragile State Index. I suppose failed state was too condescending. But the 2018 world map shows you color-coded where they see the weakest states. And the weakest states are red, yellow, orange. And you can see the world is largely red, yellow, orange, meaning that those countries have very weak governments. To further accentuate another index from the Economist Intelligence Unit, they track the state of democracies around the world. And they've seen democracies in decline for over a decade now. Between 2006 and 2016, they said the number of full democracies decreased from 27 to 19. Full democracies are green, the weakest states again in red, yellow. Headlines for the Economist Intelligence Unit Democracy Index 2018 was, "Democracy continues its disturbing retreat." More than half of the countries in the latest update of a Democratic Health Index saw their scores decline. Today, actually, less than 5% of the world's population lives in a full democracy. And of course, democracies are today the government form that best protects human rights. So we see governments' capacity to protect human rights in decline, but at the same time, another quite astonishing development has taken place, namely that multinational corporations have become increasingly powerful. And if you would compare the revenues of a multinational corporation with the gross domestic product of some countries, you would realize that many of those, in fact, half of the biggest economies in the world today are companies, not states. So Walmart would be the 10th biggest country. And then on the right, you see the 10 biggest corporations compared to economies. Walmart on place number 10, and then other companies following the rank. So with half of the largest 100 economies in the world being companies, and the capacity to govern of states in decline, what are the implications then for human rights? I just want to put out there that today there is a growing consensus that companies have a role to play for the protection of human rights, particularly in their realm. And this is exactly the intersection at which our center works. We are not focused on publishing academic articles. Instead, we do research based on rigorous academic principles, yet we package our findings very differently. We publish reports, and here are some titles. Publish research reports that are written in a way that they're accessible to a broader audience, because we do want to challenge and empower business leaders to make practical progress on the implementation of human rights. So we want to produce something that is readable and interesting to those business leaders, but it should also be informative to policymakers. And our work focuses on different industry sectors because we see those challenges being very different in each sector. We've done extensive work on the apparel industry in Bangladesh, and I'll elaborate in a minute on that. But we've also looked, for example, at the human rights issues of migrant workers that come to the Gulf to, for example, build soccer stadiums into Gulf states. And we've looked at the role that recruitment agencies play for those systemic human rights issues. In each sector, we closely analyze how does business operate and what are then the human rights impacts, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. The premise of our work at the center is that a global economy is good for human rights. After all, thanks to a global economy, 1 billion people were lifted out of extreme poverty. So we believe in the positive, potentially positive power and leverage of corporations. And to effectively address the existing human rights issues, we believe requires a critical reflection of how business is done. How do these core businesses, how is the core business designed? And how do these core businesses then affect human rights? And we do sort of that type of filter we apply to every industry sector we work in. And just mentioned the migrant workers in the Gulf, the apparel industry. We've also just fairly recently published 2 reports on the role of internet service providers, and another ongoing project is our analysis of the data that investors use to assess human rights performance. I'll get to some aspects of this later. So as I said, my first example to support my argument that corporate human rights issues cannot be addressed effectively without a reflection on the business models comes from the apparel industry in Bangladesh. A few things you need to know about the apparel industry in Bangladesh. First of all, it's an industry that has grown rather quickly thanks to the distribution of a quota system that has phased out in 2005. Bangladesh is known for an apparel industry that can produce huge volumes at fairly low cost. Bangladesh is a very poor country. It has one of the lowest minimum wages of currently around $68 per month. It's the second largest country that produces apparel for the rest of the world after China. So it's a significant sourcing destination for fashion brands. Another contextual factor for that industry is that the price of apparel has constantly been in decline over the past years. So while other costs of living have gone up, apparel actually has become much cheaper. Like one study indicates 43% within just 10 years. Another important factor to understand that industry is that it's a fashion-driven industry. And we as consumers want fashion trends from the runways in the shops as quickly as possible. And so here you can see the relationship between lead times, meaning the time it takes from the design sketch to the shop. So basically including the production time in Bangladesh, for example. And you can see that the brands with the shortest lead times are the ones that have the greatest sales growth. So Inditex, which was for a long time the leader in the industry, takes 2 months from design sketch, from runway to the shop, basically. That's incredibly fast, considering the steps involved in that supply chain. But now there are new brands like ASOS and Boohoo that actually fabricate fashion on demand. So ASOS apparently has 4,500 new styles on their site per week of stuff that hasn't been produced yet. But if you click on buy, it's going to go into production. So it's an emergence of a very new business model. Bangladesh, unfortunately, is also known for workplace-related accidents. So here I listed some from 2005 and 2012, and you can see that the numbers of fatalities is significant. The last one, November 2012, was the so-called Tazreen fire. It killed 112 people, and it was considered the wake-up call for the industry, meaning the industry said, we can't continue watching these accidents to happen in factories that produce our goods. We need to do something about it. But unfortunately, it wasn't quite enough yet. It took yet another accident. And you may recall that in 2013, on April 24, an entire building complex in the outskirts of Dhaka, in a sub-district called Savar, collapsed. The building complex hosted multiple apparel factories, and it killed over 1,100 people, injured about 2,500, and it's considered one of the deadliest industrial accidents in history. On this picture, you can see my colleagues and myself standing on the rubbles of Rana Plaza in 2014. Our center started in 6 weeks before Rana Plaza happened. And as Rana Plaza happened, we said, well, this accident, where for a very short moment the attention of the world focused on Bangladesh, a country where you usually don't hear much about, is for us the hook to take a deep dive into a supply chain that we consider emblematic for the human rights issues generally in manufacturing. So what we research in Bangladesh is not specific to Bangladesh. It's also not specific for the apparel industry. We believe our findings apply to manufacturing in general and also to other places. And so here we went to Bangladesh a year after this horrible incident to present our first research report. We presented it to local stakeholders, to a group of over 100 people. In that report, we take the first deep dive into figuring out what does the business model in Bangladesh look like. So after the accident, of course, the news were full, and a lot of those news outlets asked, how is it possible that brands didn't know about conditions, or how comes they didn't know about the production side? I mean, an interesting case was Benetton. Their product was found in the rubbles of Rana Plaza, yet it took them 5 days to figure out that, oh, they were actually in that facility. Why? Because, well, it was an unauthorized subcontract that's how Benetton product eventually ended up in one of those factories within Rana Plaza. And so it made even industry experts realize, we don't know that much about the business model, and the fashion supply chain is probably a lot more complex than we had previously assumed. So the buildup of the Tazreen fire and then the horrible accident of Rana Plaza led for the very first time for brands to come together and say, we need to collaborate. We need to create two initiatives. Well, two resulted in the end, to bring together brands to work on building safety and fire safety. So one of these initiatives is the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh. It comprises about 200 brands, most of them from Europe. And then a smaller initiative called the Alliance for Bangladesh Worker Safety comprises about 25 brands, mostly from North America. And both initiatives have the same objective, namely to improve fire and building safety in the production sites of the brands that signed up for those initiatives. Another remarkable thing happened right after Rana Plaza, and that was that the industry associations in Bangladesh, like the Bangladesh Garment Manufacturing Association, for the first time put their membership database online. Previously, they had records on paper, but for the first time, it was possible from afar to access their membership database. So there was like an momentum and increasing transparency over that industry, because of course, like we at the center, one of the first questions that we raised was like, how many factories that produce apparel for export are there actually in Bangladesh? And no one could give us a good answer. And if you want to design an adequate solution to a problem, you first have to define the problem correctly, right? You need to understand its full scale and scope. And that wasn't possible in Bangladesh initially. But after Rana Plaza, these new databases became available from Accord and Alliance, those two initiatives that brands set up, the industry associations, the BGMEA and the BKMEA. The BKMEA is the Knitting Association, and also from the Department of Inspections of Factories, so-called DIFE. And at NYU, we then said, well, it's a bit tedious, but let's start out with that to eventually prove a point. Let's combine all those separate databases and put it into one document. Sounds easy, but it took us months and a team of students who then manually deduped that database, which eventually led us to an estimate that there are about 7,000 factories in Bangladesh. This was highly controversial because the New York Times at the time still reported that there are about 4,000 factories max in Bangladesh. And we believe that's an incorrect number. But to further verify our data, we then also went out and conducted a field study where we selected 2 sub-districts in Dhaka, Tongi and Rampura, and we sent a team of researchers there to then walk every street of that district and record every single factory in that district. And they brought back a list which we could then compare to our master list. And what we found was that a lot of factories that they, in their field study, recorded didn't show up on our list. Actually, 30% of the facilities didn't show up on our list. And that was an initial indication for the actual business model in Bangladesh. So this is a very simplified picture. What we realized through this tedious numbers research was that foreign brands only deal with the first tier of factories in Bangladesh. They deal with factories that are fairly well managed, fairly well run, that are quite big. But to make the business happen in Bangladesh at very low prices, ever decreasing lead times, in an industry that's notorious for fluctuations, those, we called them hub factories, rely on their own network of subcontracting factories. And they are not an insignificant part of the industry. We still believe they make at least 30%. So here I have pictures of hub and spoke factories, and you can notice the difference. This on the left is a knitting factory. You can see the automated knitting machines, the guys wearing mouth protection for like little flimmers of garment. It's a modern place. Then the spoke factory, you can see is a bit less organized. There's a very steep stair going up, probably the only exit, emergency exit in case there's a fire. There's fabric lying all around. They're very old machines. It's a very different place. And these places are not the exception. They're the norm in Bangladesh. They're smaller, but they're all over. These are pictures I took at a research trip this year in March. And we walked down a small alley in Dhaka, and we had a local person with us who helped translate, etc. This is like the guy in the orange T-shirt. He helped us to get around, and we got into one of those subcontracting facilities, which was in an apartment complex on the 3rd floor. You can see the stairs look pretty flimsy. You can see the wiring, also very flimsy. Bad wiring, by the way, is the #1 cause of fires in factories. Here you can see sort of trim material being stacked up. This is a major fire hazard. If this catches fire, the entire thing blows up. And then on the right, you see the place where they deal with chemicals. None of them wears gloves or protection, or it's stored very poorly. And so even 5 years after Rana Plaza, these places still exist. So despite of huge efforts that brands put into establishing better standards of factory safety in Bangladesh, through the Accord and the Alliance, these places are still around. And so for us, the picture looks like this. About 2,300 facilities are covered with under the program of the Accord and Alliance, meaning inspectors go regularly to those facilities, they draw up so-called corrective action plans, etc. And then there is also a national initiative that is responsible for about 1,650 facilities. But considering that we estimate that there are 7,000 facilities out there, of course, about 3,000 facilities are completely off the radar. And if you understand the business model where with each layer the margins get thinner and thinner, and the cost of production, the only flexible cost element are workers' wages or workers' hours, workers in general, you understand that the human rights risks get greater with each layer in the supply chain. And so in terms of where do you start in a country like Bangladesh? One approach would have been to say, well, we start where the human rights risks are the greatest. Right now, all the resources and all the attention is focused on the top of the industry. We call it the tip of the iceberg. The best and biggest factories get the most support, the most attention, and they become better and bigger. but thanks to Accord and Alliance, and I don't want to, like, they've made tremendous progress in this section of the industry. In those 2,300 facilities, I think fire and building safety has improved significantly. But it has also created a bifurcation of the industry with, some factories becoming bigger and better, and the rest sort of falling off the radar entirely. I have another slide that shows this. So what are the drivers of subcontracting? Back to my argument that business models matter. First of all, access to capital is not based on production capacity, but on production volumes. So there's an incentive for those factories to exaggerate their production volumes and, outsource whenever they can. Then the brands often have very strict sourcing practices, meaning they really enforce the deadlines they set for an order shipment. So if a manufacturer cannot make the deadline, and needs to airship the order, then all profits are gone. He probably pays extra. So of course, by all costs, they try to avoid airshipment. They try to get the job done on time, meaning, well, if they're pressed on time, they also distribute to their friends and the subcontracting network that can help out. Production delays are very common in that industry. You order raw materials, often from China. Bangladesh needs to import all cotton products, etc. So when raw material arrives late, the only way to then get the job done is to make workers work overtime, etc. Another solution is, again, to subcontract. It increases efficiency also because the industry is very seasonal. There's a fluctuating demand, meaning there are peak times in the summer to produce for the Christmas shopping. And it's not very convenient for a factory manager to, when he gets a large order, to hire 300 workers and then a month later let them go again. Instead, the industry, thanks to the subcontracting networks, can flexibly expand and contract production capacity. So there are a lot of good business reasons for subcontracting. It makes a lot of good business sense. Just looking, my colleague put together another graph sort of following the accidents rates. So the media now portrays Bangladesh as an industry that has only improved. And it has improved in some part of the industry, but accidents are still occurring. This is the data from 2013 Rana Plaza to 2017. And when you look at the rates at which the programs have been implemented, after 5 years, Accord and Alliance managed what they report to address 85% of the remediation items. So inspectors went to the factories, they drew up a whole list of issues that are violating fire safety and building safety. The manufacturers themselves then were responsible for addressing these issues. And they say in about 85% of the items, corrections have been made. So it's quite significant. But then when you dive into the data, the picture is not quite that optimistic. The issues that are the gravest and the most difficult to address have been left for last because those manufacturers are hesitant to make huge investments in a sprinkler system, for example, if they don't know whether they get another order from that brand. So they wait until the last minute to make those big investments. And these are major stumbling blocks now to sort of push those factories over the finish line and sort of say, well, they've addressed all issues that were identified. The national initiative, very weak, only 25% of remediation issues have been addressed. And yes, the rest, not a single inspector has ever gone to those facilities. So for us, it's an example of, well, some portion of the industry benefited, but overall, the industry as a whole is not safer. And if you understand the business model in Bangladesh as an interconnected production network, where the first layer can't meet the price and lead time demands without second and third tier factories, well, we can conclude it's not as safe as we would have hoped for. So now I switch to being a bit more theoretical. This is a learning chart, organizational learning chart that a guy named Simon Zedek has drawn up in 2004, so quite a while ago. Simon Zedek is an academic, but also he was a consultant to one apparel brand, Nike, for over a decade. And he used his experience as a consultant to Nike to describe their evolution of CSR. He called, it's a very highly cited article in Harvard Business Review, The Path Towards Corporate Social Responsibility. And he identifies 5 typical stages. He says initially, as these child labor cases in South Asian footwear factories came up, Nike said, well, we're not responsible. These are not our facilities. Then they realized, well, we should at least comply with local laws. Eventually, they said, well, we have to somehow make this part of our supply chain management. Then they realized, hey, now that we've started this, we can maybe even gain a strategic advantage by engaging in CSR. And for example, Nike was the very first apparel brand that published their supply base list. So you can now look up all the production sites of Nike. In the civil stage, Nike said, sort of the most advanced stage of CSR, companies realize that many of those issues they can't do themselves. They need to get together with peers to address systemic issues. So Nike was one of the founding brands of the Fair Labor Association, a multi-stakeholder initiative with the mission to improve labor rights in global supply chains. Nike had basically no business in Bangladesh, that's why they are not in the accord, but they're quite supportive of these collective approaches. And I know that's something that some of you discussed in today's class. Specifically, that's something that I observed having worked for the Fair Labor Association and consulted to apparel brands over the years. The evolution of CSR in the apparel industry is quite impressive. And yes, it starts out, as Zedek described, as a defensive industry, but that didn't last long because they didn't win anything with that defensive strategy. They very quickly realized that they at least have to comply with local laws, and then eventually, of course, NGOs always also pressured them to accept international labor standards and put those international labor standards in contracts with the suppliers. And then an entire industry developed to ensure that what's in the contract is actually implemented, because just putting it onto a piece of paper, of course, it doesn't make it a reality. So brands started with policing approaches, going to factories with checklists and running through those checklists like yes, no, done, not done. And then they realized, well, we come back every year and we get the same issues, so we need to improve the policing, and they moved on to monitoring. It's basically involving quality managers, improving the questionnaires, doing worker interviews. That's what I would call monitoring. And then they evolved their CSR activities further and said, well, it still doesn't give us the results we had hoped for. Let's do capacity building, because we eventually need to empower the people there, the workers there, to speak up for their rights. We have to train the management of the factories to establish these labor rights. And so they even give support for training, for social dialogue, improved industrial relations to enable this type of self-regulation. And then, yes, of course, also the collective approach. Apparel brands get together in multi-stakeholder initiatives to specifically look into how can we establish a living wage, etc. So all this is going on. So quite an impressive evolution of CSR activities. Yet, no one has ever raised the question in that industry, how do the core businesses in the apparel industry affect human rights? And that's something that we are focused on at the center. In the apparel industry, to focus on core business practices would mean to analyze very critically those purchasing practices of brands. And in conversations with factory managers in Bangladesh, we heard that some brands source differently. And that was like, how does that work? So we asked, what type of brands do you work for? Which brands are easier to work for? Which brands are harder? To then filter out what type of purchasing practices make the compliance with human rights standards more likely. And we found quite interesting characteristics of a sourcing model that is a lot more compatible with a corporate commitment to human rights. And it starts out with the brand making a longer-term commitment to a factory. So instead of just going in with an order and then leaving again, some brands are now creating so-called strategic partnerships. Uniqlo, a Japanese brand, actually built its business this way. Nike has now transitioned to those strategic partnerships. H&M is transitioning because they realize there are also business gains to be made by committing to working with one factory longer term. It allows them to train them, to improve their productivity, but also to improve their compliance ratings. It changes a relationship from being completely transactional and top-down into a relationship that is relational, where the brand can talk to the supplier, and in case of delays, for example, something very common, they can negotiate. Or in case the brand makes some last-minute design changes because all of a sudden the green buttons are more trendy than the red buttons, and then the manufacturer has to order the green buttons, and that causes delays. These are things that then can be discussed. Maybe they can get an extension of the deadline, or if there's an unforeseen order volume change, all of a sudden a lot more people than, let's say, H&M expected really want this pink t-shirt. They can negotiate with the manufacturer if this is at all possible to produce additional numbers of t-shirts. So it changes the relationship. A conversation becomes possible, and from what we've heard, and we are keen to test this further, those specific elements, there are business models that allow for fast fashion to be profitable and competitive, yet also enable the commitment to human rights to be real. And so for us, the key to address human rights issues in the apparel industry is to look deeply into those purchasing practices in the apparel industry. And just to follow up, this is another picture. We then thought about who can become a driver of these alternative business models in the apparel industry. And one key driver, of course, are investors. So we wanted to understand, how do investors assess company human rights performance at this point in time? And here you see 12 frameworks of investment frameworks that assess ESG data, environmental, social, government data. And we just wanted to understand, so how do they actually measure whether H&M is better than the Gap? How do they do that? So first of all, we saw that the S in ESG is the least developed element in ESG data. The S out of ESG only makes 14% of the overall indicators that are being used. So it's the weakest and smallest part. And then within the S, we collected the indicators of those 12 frameworks that measure the S in ESG. And we arrived at 1,700 indicators, which we then ran through a standard monitoring and evaluation frame. And we realized that purchasing practices, for example, in food and beverage or manufacturing, only make 3% of those indicators. So most indicators are still largely focused on intentions or anecdotal examples. So typically, these S indicators in ESG frameworks ask for policies and procedures, but not really on anything related to those purchasing practices. So for investors to set incentives for a transition in the apparel industry from a transactional to a relational model, those indicators would need to change as well. And one need to develop indicators that deeply go into those purchasing practices. And this is exactly a project we're currently engaged in, because we want to show that different indicators are possible. We don't, it says virtually nothing whether you have a human rights policy or not in terms of your actual human rights performance. It's not a good measure for what you actually want to know. And for an investor that wants to also assess risks, this is just not the right way of assessing human rights. So we want to focus in the development of indicators on purchasing practices to give investors a way to look into those core business practices. And just to give you a flavor, these are some of the indicators we've started developing, and they get very, very technical. So in the planning and pre-production phase, we looked at, we think it would make sense, we still have to test that, to look at the deviance between the capacity booked versus the capacity used. So are there any major volume changes that then affect production and affect workers? On cost and payment, we want to know what's the percentage of orders that use premium shipment, meaning air freight, which is not a good sign for a well-managed process, because that's really something that the manufacturers want to avoid, because when they have to airship, it's so expensive they don't make a profit. It's just one indicator that something is not running well. On quality and compliance, we think one smarter way of assessing human rights performance would be to look at the annual turnover rate of factories. So how often does a brand change its suppliers, or are they loyal to their suppliers over multiple years? So this is how we hope to incentivize that human rights issues start to be driven by a reflection on the business models. So now I want to get to the technology industry, quite different. Again, to highlight that it takes an assessment of the business models to understand what it takes to effectively address human rights issues. So this is a report we published last year, Harmful Content, the Role of Internet Platform Companies in Fighting Terrorist Incitement and Politically Motivated Disinformation. And of course, the internet could be a fantastic thing for human rights. It enables freedom of expression, it enables access to education, and it creates economic opportunities, no doubt about that. And for a long time, those companies were really seen as the good guys that make the world a good place. But lately, the internet has become polluted with harmful content. And harmful content, for example, terrorist incitement, at some point in time, they estimated that about 200,000 messages were sent by ISIS per day to incite violence and to get to recruit new members. Similarly, politically motivated disinformation is affecting our elections. That's a big topic in the US, particularly now, just before the midterm elections. And so that has raised the question, are these companies, those internet service providers, are they just passive hosts, or are they content editors? Are they just a platform that put out whatever is out there? Or should they become full editors that edit the content of their sites? And we believe, well, their role lies somewhere in between. They're neither just enablers and a vessel through which information can be provided, nor should they become full content editors. However, again, we asked, how do these platforms actually make money? And we did interviews in Silicon Valley and found that the big internet service providers make their money through ads. They're essentially online ad companies. For Google, Facebook, and Twitter, 89% of the revenue comes from ads. So how is the ad business driving their decisions related to human rights? Well, here's a study that shows that fake news are a lot more exciting for users than mainstream news. It's fake news that are more extreme, more radical. That's where people spend more time on. So if you run a business that lives of ad revenue, and fake news are more popular than mainstream news, you can imagine that the site's algorithms, of course, also further pushes those stories to the top. Because when people spend more time on it, they look at the ads longer, and they probably click on those ads eventually, and that's how those platforms make money. So what solutions did we suggest to companies in specifically? Let me jump over that. So first of all, we argue, well, they have to improve their algorithms and increase human oversight. At this point, I think these companies are quite desperate to hire machine learning specialists because they deal with huge volumes that they need to scan for harmful content, and yet those artificial intelligence mechanisms are not perfect. It still requires human oversight, and after like a lot of public pressure for those sites to do a lot more, last year Google and Facebook agreed to hire each 10,000 additional content moderators to go through whatever's being uploaded. It's a major undertaking. A representative of Google told me last year that they deal with 400 hours of content uploaded to the Google site per minute. So it's huge. Another recommendation we make to companies is that they should introduce more friction, meaning they should put out warnings if content is debated a lot, if the source is unclear. So basically, they should enable more discussion over content. And recently, YouTube has, for example, toughened its stance towards videos that contain inflammatory religious or supremacist content, but do not cross the line and violate company policies. Such material now comes with a warning and is not eligible for recommended status, endorsements, or user comments. Similarly, Facebook has introduced the fact-checking functions, and if the content is highly disputed, Facebook discourages sharing. So they have reacted, they have done things. We also advise them to advance industry collaboration so that they can fully benefit from sharing knowledge. So for example, those companies have created platforms where they can share information about terrorist content. They also work through the Global Network Initiative, a multi-stakeholder initiative that was set up 10 years ago. So they're doing quite a bit on all fronts. They've hired more human oversight. So I can give examples of how some companies have followed up on some of the recommendations we gave. But now I get to the last point, namely reconsider the business model of advertising, which we consider as an undermining factor. And I can't give you any practical examples of those internet service companies where they have seriously done something about their business model. And so to me, again, companies engage in CSR, but it's not quite enough to get to the desired outcomes. And to make this clear to you, again, an example of the Russian election meddling. In 2016, the Internet Research Agency, a Russian intelligence-created institution, created more than 400 pages, which were seen by more than 126 million Americans. On Twitter, 50,000 Russian-linked bots tweeted about the election. So there was major interference. And so that, of course, caused a public outcry, and it forced companies to react. And very encouraging, the Twitter CEO said, well, this year we're removing 214% more accounts from platform manipulation than last year. And Facebook has also reported that it has tweaked its algorithm, that it's partnering with third-party fact-checkers, and that they're using advanced machine learning algorithms to detect and shut down millions of fake accounts. So one should think much improved situation, right, from the 2016 election. I can tell you just now a study came out from the Knight Foundation, which highlights that 80% of the accounts responsible for most of the fake news in 2016 were still active today, as recently as October 2018. And they estimate that 70% of those accounts spreading fake news and conspiracies are bots or semi-automated. That means that's surprising because bots and semi-automated accounts are the easiest to detect. So an improvement of 214% from last year doesn't mean that much if, bottom line, the performance is not where we want it to be. I would argue this also, the fact that it hasn't improved as much as we want to a point that we can say, well, human rights are respected, can affect the business model, because in 2017 there were a number of news stories where brands pulled their ads from the sites because their company logo appeared next to terrorist content, homophobic content, not something that those brands wanted to be affiliated with. So to get to the question of what then makes CSR and business and human rights so distinct. Marcus will hate this highly simplified chart because it doesn't include the approach that we engaged in for years, namely political CSR. But this is sort of the CSR how practitioners understand it. And so I can tell you here in Europe, I think the understanding of CSR is more advanced than in the US, where clearly CSR is pretty much still anything from philanthropy to sponsoring to anything. It's a very broad term. CSR is still often done out of a marketing department, out of PR, the implementation of CSR then is really up to whatever the company wants to do under the label of CSR. And political CSR is something that I wrote my dissertation about and we both published about. Like my highest cited paper is about political CSR. And the concept of political CSR is virtually unheard of in practice. So that's why I think it's not relevant for this specific slide where I really focus on the implementation. The implementation of CSR, I would say, has, as you've seen, undergone an impressive evolution in the apparel industry, and even a young industry like the tech industry has responded to some recommendations that have been made to them to address harmful content. Yet, to this day, CSR for those companies basically means business as usual plus some additions. Maybe some philanthropic or sponsorship activities, or maybe some checks in their supply chain. But it doesn't involve a radical reflection on their business models. And this is where I see the big difference between business and human rights. On the definition side, it's easier because we have a reference point, a normative foundation with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As of June 2011, we also have the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights that ascribe an explicit role of companies to respect human rights. And so the implementation of business and human rights can be a lot more concrete than for CSR. We would expect an analysis of human rights impacts and an alignment of core business practices with the corporate commitment to respect human rights according to those industry-specific standards that can then also be operationalized and measured, so you can develop metrics to actually, like we've done for investors, to assess human rights performance. Stay with me for like another 2 minutes. So someone who takes this argument one step further is Anand Giridharadas. He's a New York Times columnist, foreign correspondent, and he just published this book in September 2018 entitled Winners Take All, the elite charade of changing the world. And the book is full of examples where the elites, very rich people, engage in wonderful projects to save the world. But at the same time, they're also fighting tax reforms, etc. And they are using money for their philanthropic projects that they made through means not respectful of human rights. And so you may then, like, against this background, one could maybe add a question mark to the title of my presentation. Are these truly unintended consequences? Are they truly unintended? I have a nice quote from a fashion brand representative who admitted to us that operating in Bangladesh means working with one eye open and one eye closed. She said, if we place an order that exceeds the production capacity of a factory, we should know that the production ends up someplace else, a place we've never inspected, probably full of human rights risks. So I don't want to get too much into those motivations because I know so many good people at corporations. And of course, corporations are not monolithic. There are different departments. And so often the CSR department is quite isolated from the rest of the business. But a better title for this presentation may be Intention Undermining Business Models. And so ideally at a corporation, at a fashion company, I would argue the CSR person should sit in the sourcing department where purchasing practices are defined. This would make most sense for a full integration of a commitment to human rights and how it's reflected in the business model. So, where does this leave us? So I hope that this presentation has showed to you that human rights are relevant for business. They're also relevant for business education, because after all, we need a lot more research to identify those alternative business models that make it possible that profits and principles can coexist.